Hi, this is Dr. Ray, and this week we are going to talk about folk tales, fairy tales, everything in between. So let's jump right in. Why are so many fairy tales or even folk tales so dark? And before we jump into the specific definitions, as you're reading some of these versions, you might be, why are they so sad? Why are they so gritty? Why is there so much death? Remember that the idea that children should have their own special literature, that literature should be sanitized, like cleaned up for children's perusal, is very much like a Victorian 19th century, 1800s idea that we need to protect the innocence of childhood. These are stories that were just passed on and enjoyed by adults and children. So just keep that in mind if you're wondering, why are things a little violent, a little dark? We'll talk about Disneyfication at the end of this lecture, but that's a relatively new concept. So, folklore, these are tales that are passed down via speech. And if you think about that word folk, whether you're looking at the Old English definition or the Germanic definition, it tends to mean common people. And so the people in these stories, the main characters, tend to be humble, right? It's not really princesses, kings, queens, like dukes and knights. It's the people that you would see in Jack and the Beanstalk, right? They're starving farmers, or Little Red Riding Hood, right? Lower class, like wandering through the woods to bring food to grandma because no one else can do it. There's typically no magic in folk tales, what we consider folk tales, and we're trying to set them apart from fairy tales, though there's talking animals. So if you think about Aesop's fables, Tortoise and the Hare, Fox and the Grapes, the animals are given human-like qualities, but otherwise there's not magic. There's not sorcerers or enchantments or things like that. They're broad life lessons. So for example, if you know the tale of the scorpion and the frog, it's more than just good and evil and good wins. There's like a moral there about understanding someone's nature. And if you don't know that one, I suggest looking it up. It's really interesting. So we've done folk tales. What are fairy tales? So fairy tales is actually a French term that Charles Perrault, and I'll try to say the French version. My French is not very good. Established in the late 1600s when he collected and published a group of folk tales that he dubbed fairy tales, and all of them had this magical element. And so, again, fairy tales are usually associated with these tales that have been published. So they're static, they're not changing, it's not folklore that's evolving. Um, there tend to be magical elements beyond talking animals, right? You've got magic beans like Jack and the Beanstalk. You have So again, the magical or spiritual elements that you find in fairy tales, you're less likely to find in what we deem folk tales. Um, Mostly, a lot more often than you'll see in folk tales, is that the good surmounts the evil, and that also the characters tend to be more royal, right? Like you've got a prince involved, like in Cinderella, and we'll build upon that in just a few moments. So I do want to be very clear that these genres blur, right? That we want to be able to firmly say, well, this is a folk tale and this is a fairy tale. There's some stories that you're like, which is it? So, for example, Billy Goat's Gruff, it seems almost like an Aesop's fable, like a folk tale, because you have the three goats that are three brothers, almost like people trying to cross this bridge. But a troll is a magical creature. So, does that make it a fairy tale? It blurs and we're not sure. Same thing with like Aladdin's lamp, which was, captured in like the written word in 1200 and 1001 Nights. But it also has the folklore elements of Aladdin is like, very common person, but then you have the magic lamp. So again, I understand that it blurs. We try to categorize them and we do our best, but certainly there's a gray area there. So let's talk about, I'm going to be an American and say Charles Perrault, though I'm sure it's Charles Perrault. Again, French and I do not get along very well, the French language. Um, Charles Perrault was born to wealthy parents. He was an author and an academic. He studied law. He had a career in government. He helped create the Academy of the Sciences and it called the Academy of Painting, like these long-standing institutions that are still very much in France. He was part of Louis XIV's inner circle, so he was like a courtier himself. But then when he was in his 50s, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but he kind of had a falling out with the monarchy and was kind of being pushed out of those elite circles. And in kind of a bid to make himself relevant, again, he collected all of these folk tales, French folk tales, European folk tales, titled it, what was it called? My brain is working, my friends. Stories or tales from past time, tales of Mother Goose, fairy tales. So he came up with this term. fairy tales in 1697. And this anthology included Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. These stories were based on ancient folk tales, but he very much gave them a modern twist. He used language that very much appealed to intellectuals and elite readers. It was very vivid. He changed endings and characters to fit kind of the value systems of the time. So we'll talk about Red Riding Hood. He has Red Riding Hood not being warned, and she's beautiful and innocent and sweet, and she is killed by the wolf. So there's like a clear moral there that beautiful young women should be wary of strangers. Women are very subservient in these stories. That he's including Christian morality because, of course, it's a Christian nation. So just need to keep in mind that he again was taking these stories, but bending them to fit the belief system of his readers, which is actually really smart marketing on his part, right? Because he wanted to be relevant again, and he immediately was. The story took off. It was translated and published in the U.S. and England just a few decades later. He really, established himself. This is what we know him for. The Grimm brothers, we always think of them as the first people to really collect fairy tales and write them down. They're writing 100 years later than Charles Perrault. So they have kind of a different journey towards their collection as well. So Jacob and Wilhelm were born in the 1700s. Their father died when they were like 10 and 11, and the family was suddenly thrust into poverty. But they were brilliant young men. They wanted to go to university. They attended the University of Marburg. They both became very interested in folklore. So in the stories told by common folk, orally, and they wanted to capture them. They wanted to document them. I don't think like Perrault, they were out for, fame per se. They just felt these were things that needed to be written down in the versions they were encountering. So they published Grimm's Brothers' Household Tales in 1812. It had 86 stories, and they really saw it as academic work. They weren't really writing this for children. But as further editions came along, they sanitized it, right? People were offended by some of the ideas in print. So, for example, if you know the story of Rapunzel, the witch keeps her in a tower her whole life. She lets down her hair. The prince climbs up secretly. In the story, the first version, the witch finds out the prince has been coming up because Rapunzel's like, oh, why doesn't my dress fit? Why is my belly getting bigger? Because she's pregnant and she doesn't know how that works. Well, people were kind of offended. So it was sanitized, cleaned up. Things got left out in future editions. Also, there was this huge move to stop saying, like in Red Riding Hood, that in Hansel and Gretel, that the mother suggested, let's abandon our children in the woods. If there was a mean mother, they always made her stepmother because it upset people to imagine that a mother could ever behave this way. So, this brings us to a concept we really need to talk about, which is intertextuality. So, make sure this term is staying fresh in your mind. An aspect of literature which a new text may assimilate, contradict, or ironically echo previous versions of a story. So, for example, my son Jack is obsessed with the Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan, which is based on Greek mythology. So, there's an intertextuality there in that he's taking all these established myths and writing them in a new modern way. They are connected, they can't be divided. You can't just say, oh, Percy Jackson exists by itself. It's totally dependent on these, as well as other texts, but on these ancient stories that have been collected and retold. So, there's an intertextuality between Grimm and Perrault. Because yes, Brothers Grimm went out and collected folklore, but it's 100 years after Perrault's stories have been published, which they surely read, and that impacted the way people retold it. So there's two different versions of Red Riding Hood, right? Perrault's French version, I mentioned that Little Red Riding Hood didn't get any warnings, and then in the end, the wolf eats her and her grandmother, so she's gone. There's a clear moral. Don't be, naive. Um, don't talk to strangers. Beautiful, sweet little girls will be gobbled up and destroyed, right? So very much about like a lady's reputation, if we want to unpack it that way. Whereas in the Grimm's fairy tale, the mother warns her to stay on the path. And she tries. We know we can read that one. You can go read that one if you want to, the Grimm's version. But in the end, when she and her mother are eaten by the wolf, because the wolf is waiting for her at grandma's house, the axeman, right, that comes and chops up the wolf, and the mother and girl survive. The mother and girl, the grandmother and Red Riding Hood survive. So there's kind of a more ambiguous moral there that yes, children should be wary, but it's not the child died. It's a warning, it's very different. So we got to keep that in mind when we read these texts. So, time to jump to American folk tales, or as we'd like to call them, tall tales. And I will change that um, in my presentation. I'll accept either American folk tales, American tall tales, but these are stories that have been passed down orally and have evolved since Europeans first arrived in the US, dating back to the 1500s. Reading them can kind of help us understand American history and culture, past and current values, social hurdles that we were trying to deal with, um, changes in industry. We'll talk about that with John Henry. But these figures, and I have the blue bowl to bring up, Babe and the Blue. Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox, or Johnny Appleseed, or Pecos Bill, just the idea of these like superhuman, attributes of some of these characters, and how it brought forth like the idea of like manifest destiny and bigger, more powerful in the US. Like all these stereotypes that are still kind of around were represented in these characters from tall tales and folk tales. So the folk tale that we are reading this week is John Henry. And John Henry, if you don't know, is an American tall tale, but he was actually a person. John Henry was from New Jersey, they think. And when he was 19, he was arrested for petty theft. And again, this would have been right after the Civil War. So we don't know more about his life than that. But again, so many African Americans that had formerly been slaves were freed and were looking for, honest jobs, and there weren't many. But according to the actual John Henry's legacy or history, his biography, is that he was sentenced to work for 10 years to the C&O Railroad Company as they were, driving a railroad across the country, and in particular West Virginia. And this is a picture of, the Great Bend Tunnel. They were trying to drive through a mountain. And John Henry is supposed to have been like, massive, muscular, really strong. He could drive not only the stakes in for the railroad stakes for the railroad itself, but stakes into rock that would leave a hole where dynamite could be put in to set off an explosion and create a tunnel. So, according to it was first an African American folk ballad, and then an oral tale, and then finally like written down. And it became books, and there's an amazing animation that Disney did recently that's really great. But according to the tale, a traveling salesman comes by and he has like some steam powered drill that he says can replace all the workers and take their jobs, despite the fact that they've been promised, 50 acres of land when they complete the job. And John Henry is going to prove that he is faster than the machine, and he defeats the machine. He is faster, but he dies from the exertions. Lots of ways to read the moral of this, but it's just really famous story, and I'm excited for you to see the version that's actually being taught in a lot of schools with some beautiful watercolors and print, so you'll check that out. Yixian is the Chinese Cinderella story. So this is probably the oldest thing that we are reading. It can be dated back to 800 BC. I mean, 800 AD or CE, however we say that. It was a Chinese folk tale first written down during the Tang Dynasty, so it honestly probably predates that by hundreds of years. It's just the first time it was transcribed. It very much resembles the European version of Cinderella with the evil stepmother, evil stepsister instead of sisters, the father that, passes away and leaves her to these cruel women and her family. There is a magic shoe. I will let you realize it, read through it, and come to your own realizations. There's the same idea of this idealized femininity that people would fall in love with immediately, this like sweet, submissive, kind, and also like physically beautiful woman. Um, Violent death for the stepmother and stepsister, which was also true like in Charles Perrault's Cinderella. Violence there too, if you're ever interested in looking at it, like people hacking off their heels trying to fit into the magic shoe. But I'm excited for us to look at, again, bring in some more global folk tales into, or even fairy tales into our readings this week. Hansel and Gretel, probably very familiar to you. People think this oral version of the folk tale, again, fairy tale question mark, but fairy tales weren't being printed yet when it came out, so folk tale. Came about during a great famine that was taking place in Europe in the 1300s, when sadly there was a precedent of families abandoning their children because they couldn't feed them. and even leaving them in the woods. This was also a moment in history when people believed in witches, very much so. We don't need to get into the dark history of that. But so these kind of events came together to create this folk tale. Again, in the original version, it's usually a mother and a mother suggesting we leave the children in the woods. Even the 1812 Grimm's fairy tale version, which I have you reading, but people were so offended by that the Grimm brothers changed it to stepmother, so it wasn't their actual biological mother that would do this. Another thing to keep in mind that especially when the story came about, in the like 1300s, even like medieval era, if we're going before that, forests that hadn't been civilized, if that's the right word, were seen as dark, dangerous places. You didn't know what was taking place behind the trees. It was very easy to be lost. So it very much adds to this element of kind of suspense, anxiety, and horror in the story. And just like I mentioned with the Cinderella, there's so many different versions. I don't want to suggest this is just a Germanic tale. There are Romanian versions, Russian, Portuguese, Southern India, but all of them seem to have this common trope of the witch trying to lead the children in with a house made of sweets. And there's a really symbolic ending. I want you to think about how the children kind of outwit her and which child saves the day and how, because it's very interesting. Finally, we're going to Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid. I think it's interesting that this fairy tale in particular, he created all on his own. I mean, I'm sure there's some folk tales somewhere with mermaids in it, but this story that we're all familiar with that Disney popularized in the 90s was completely his own invention. Hans Christian Andersen is a really interesting, odd duck if you ever have a chance to read about him. I first encountered him when I was studying Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens' children loved The Little Mermaid and other Hans Christian Andersen stories like The Ugly Duckling and Princess and the Pea. And so he invited Andersen to stay with him. And house guests usually you wouldn't think would stay that long. He made himself comfortable for 5 weeks, Hans Christian Andersen. So Dickens had a lot of frustrating feelings towards Andersen. But moving forward, that's neither here nor there. He again was Danish. His parents had humble origins. His mother was a washerwoman, and his father only had a grade school education. But they told him that he had a noble lineage. One scholar suggests he was an illegitimate son of the current king. Everything I've looked at suggests that was not true. But his father did read A Thousand and One Nights to him repeatedly. If you haven't heard the Scheherazade stories, that includes Aladdin, they captured his imagination. When his father passed away, he was sent to a school for, impoverished children. And as soon as he could, he left there and decided he was going to be an actor and joined an acting troupe. But the folks at the acting troupe recognized his writing talent and said, dude, you're not an actor, but you're a really good writer. And he took that to heart and he started writing poetry and plays. And he seemed to always find patrons, people who wanted to support him. And like Grimm and Perrault, he documented the stories he heard growing up, but also wrote a lot of his own. Unlike the other two, he was creating stories from his own imagination. So you can go through and see which stories he was just translating and changing and which were his own. Little Mermaid, completely his own invention. It was published in his collection in 1837. So again, this is that era we talked about, the era of the child. We're really, pushing for things that can just entertain children. But his stories are written for children and adults. The beginning of the story, and I don't want to ruin it for you, is very much like the Disney version you might be familiar with, but there is so much pain in this story, just like what it felt for her to walk on land. They say was like, stepping on knives. And there's just lots of descriptions of the physical pain she goes through in trying to become a person to woo this prince. The ending is not a happy one. It's not necessarily a terrible one, but there's a lot of critical divide on what this theme of like self-sacrifice means. Do we see the ending as hopeful or tragic? Is it religious? Is the mermaid a Christ-like figure? Is it a warning about abusive relationships? Is it about sacrifice? I've read some scholars that have said that it's pretty clear that Hans Christian Andersen um, was celibate, but he was gay and was deeply in love with his friend Edward, and it was an unrequited love. So is a story a reflection of that? So many different ways to read this story. I want to end by talking about kind of the Disneyfication, which is a word I guess I'm making up, of a lot of stories. So again, we talked about Cinderella, right? In the original versions, even the more sanitized Grimm or Perrault versions, the stepmother and stepsister die. People are like hacking off heels to fit into the shoes. Like there's just darkness, right? There's a lot more. Like I mentioned in the Grimm's version, that Rapunzel, was pregnant and didn't understand how that happened. Disney very much so, like, cleaned things up, to an exceedingly, I would almost say, like, sterile degree, but, they didn't invent this, like, Perrault and Grimm were tinkering with stories so they would be more popular because the less people you offend, the more likely to purchase and read or, appreciate what you're trying to do. I do wanna mention the Hays Movie Code. So, in the 1930s, Will H. Hays was the president of the Motion, Picture Society, and he came up with a very strict set of rules that was adopted by the Motion Picture Association, and I have taught them in my English 112 when I teach Streetcar Named Desire. It was like nothing could have an unhappy ending. You will not, portray a priest in a negative light. There will be no violence. There'll be no reference to sex. There'll be no, basically, G version everything, right? Was the law from the 1930s to 50s. And while adult movies got the rights back to include, more questionable things, children's movies for a long time kind of stayed at this G level, and Disney very much capitalized on that. So we just need to think about how our versions of fairy tales and folk tales have maybe been twisted to some degree, by this sanitizing. And I wanna kinda jump back to, I've got a picture of Cinderella here. Cinderella came out in the 1950s. So in the 1940s, there was this huge movement during World War II for women to, like, get in the factories and to help out with the war effort. You might have seen the poster of Rosie the Riveter. But when men came back from war, those who survived, there was this huge movement for women to go back to the kitchen, to be more submissive, to be sweet, to be happy with their domestic role. And again, I'm being very general, but there was, a big social movement. And this is reflected in the movie that came out. Cinderella came out directly afterwards. And if you remember the Disney version, Cinderella never talks back to her stepmother and stepsisters, even when they're ripping the clothes from her body. She sings while she cleans. She's sweet, she's submissive, and the mice need to rescue her so she can meet the prince. So, very much a product of the time. Whereas if you look at the movie Brave, which came out in 2012, very much reflects more modern values, right? She doesn't want to marry. She doesn't marry in the end. She's independent. She's fierce, and that's kind of celebrated. But in the early 2000s, there was a great book that came out called Cinderella Ate My Daughter, which talks about kind of the romantic love trope that became kind of problematic through Snow White and Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. And another thing we need to think about is how these stories are told, is how others are portrayed. And I have this image from Disney's Aladdin that in the way that the middle, like, this is set in the Middle East, even though we won't even unpack that. But so many stereotypes are brought in. If you ever get to read Said's Orientalism, it's fascinating when how like the West romanticizes the East with like sword swallowers and flying carpets and snake charmers and harems, like all these things we see in just this 5-minute scene in Aladdin when he's singing the one jump song. Just the way that fairy tales can kind of be twisted to reflect current belief systems. So I want to keep that in mind, that stories are still always changing in the way that they're retold, the way that they're put into film. But I hope you have a better understanding of the origins a lot of these fairy tales and folk tales that we keep encountering came from.